1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 119/150. Journey to Moab, outside the territory of Saul, and suggested by family ties through Ruth, the Moabitess grandmother of Jesse, Ruth 4 verse 17. The Wycliffe Bible commentary adds, the whole clan apparently joined David in exile. In the East, it is not uncommon for a whole family to be put to death for the fault of one member, and the massacre at Nob showed David's family what they might expect. What David did in bringing his parents to Moab and asking for asylum for them is a beautiful object lesson for those who are called upon to wait for the Lord. It takes strength of heart to wait for God, as David expresses in one of his Psalms, "Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord." 1. And David did well in creating for himself and his family circumstances where he could allow himself to wait. From v.5, we would get the impression that David returned to Adullam and that the prophet Gad told him not to stay there. But the pulpit commentary suggests that David was in Moab and that Gad told him not to stay there. We read, this sudden appearance of the prophet suggests one scholar's question, how came he among such people? But, in the first place, David's followers were not all of the sort described in ver. 2. And next, this must be regarded as a declaration of the prophetic order in his favor, as we have a summary of David's proceedings in ver. 4. Extending over some time, during which the massacre of the priests at Nob took place, we may well suppose that Saul had alienated from him the minds of all religious people, and that Gad, probably by Samuel's command, came to be David's counselor. The advice he gives is, most important, abide not in the hold. I do not remain in the land of Moab. Had David done so, he probably would never have become king. By remaining in Judah and protecting the people from the Philistines, which Saul could no longer do, David grew in reputation and power, and from the list of those who joined him at Ziklag. 1 Chronicles 12 verses 1 to 22, it is evident not only that such was the case, but that there was a strong enthusiasm for him throughout not merely Judah, but all Israel. In the happier times which followed, Gad became David's seer. 2 Samuel 24 verse 11 was God's messenger to punish David for numbering the people, Abidver 13, and finally wrote a history of his life. 1 Chronicles 29 verse 29. As he thus survived David, he must have been a young man when he joined him, and possibly had been a companion of David in the prophetic schools at Naioth in Ramah. 6. The price of helping David 22:6-23. 6. Now Saul heard that David and his men had been discovered, and Saul, spear in hand, was seated under the tamarisk tree on the hill at Gibeah, with all his officials standing around him. 7. Saul said to them, listen, men of Benjamin, will the son of Jesse give all of you fields and vineyards? Will he make all of you commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds? 8. Is that why you have all conspired against me? No one tells me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse. None of you is concerned about me or tells me that my son has incited my servant to lie in wait for me, as he does today. 9. But Doeg the Edomite, who was standing with Saul's officials, said, I saw the son of Jesse come to Ahimelech son of Ahitub at Nob. 10. Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him. He also gave him provisions, and the sword of Goliath the Philistine. 11. Then the king sent for the priest Ahimelech son of Ahitub and his father's whole family, who were the priests at Nob, and they all came to the king. 12. Saul said, listen now, son of Ahitub. Yes, my lord, he answered. 1. Psalms 27 verse 14. 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 120/150. 13. Saul said to him, why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, giving him bread and a sword and inquiring of God for him, so that he has rebelled against me and lies in wait for me, as he does today? 14. Ahimelech answered the king, who of all your servants is as loyal as David, the king's son-in-law, captain of your bodyguard, and highly respected in your household? 15. Was that day the first time I inquired of God for him? Of course not. Let not the king accuse your servant or any of his father's family, for your servant knows nothing at all about this whole affair. 16 But the king said, You will surely die, Ahimelech, you and your father's whole family. 17 Then the king ordered the guards at his side, Turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because they too have sided with David. They knew he was fleeing, yet they did not tell me. But the king's officials were not willing to raise a hand to strike the priests of the Lord. 18 The king then ordered Dog, You turn and strike down the priests. So Dog the Edomite turned and struck them down. That day he killed 85 men who wore the linen ephod. 19 He also put to the sword Nob, the town of the priests, with its men and women, its children and infants, and its cattle, donkeys, and sheep. 20 But Abiathar, a son of Ahimelech son of Ahitub, escaped and fled to join David. 21 He told David that Saul had killed the priests of the Lord. 22 Then David said to Abiathar, That day, when Dog the Edomite was there, I knew he would be sure to tell Saul. I am responsible for the death of your father's whole family. 23 Stay with me. Don't be afraid. The man who is seeking your life is seeking mine also. You will be safe with me. The scene is an open-air council meeting in Gibeah. Whether this means that Saul had already set out in his pursuit of David, or whether a casual encounter with some of his soldiers turned into an official gathering, we do not know. Saul had been informed that David had been seen in Judah. There is no indication which Gibeah is meant here. There was a place by that name in Judah, but also in the territory of Benjamin. It was most likely Gibeah of Saul, mentioned earlier in the book. 1 The fact that Saul addresses the people around him as men of Benjamin pleads for the latter. About the fact that Saul was surrounded only by people of his own tribe, the pulpit commentary observes, Saul had evidently failed in blending the 12 tribes into one nation. He had begun well, and his great feat of delivering Jabesh Gilead by summoning the militia of all Israel together must have given them something of a corporate feeling and taught them their power when united. Yet now we find him isolated, and this address to his officers seems to show that he had aggrandized his own tribe at the expense of the rest. Moreover, he appeals to the worst passions of these men and asks whether they can expect David to continue this favoritism, which had given them riches and all posts of power. And then he turns upon them and fiercely accuses them of banding together in a conspiracy against him, to conceal from him the private understanding which existed between his own son and his enemy. The fact that Saul could only think in terms of conspiracy was an indication of his mental condition, as well as of the fact that fellowship with God was non-existent. God had rejected him as king, and now he felt that his people were doing the same. Joyce G. Baldwin, in 1 and 2 Samuel, remarks, It is impossible not to feel sympathy for Saul in his isolation, yet it is of his own making. Neither his son nor David, whom he still regards as his servant, would have deserted him had Saul himself not driven them away by his attempts to murder them. Now he imagines that David is lying in wait to kill Saul, so attributing to David the motivation he himself would have had in similar circumstances. Saul's speech seems to indicate that he had used his office as king to show favoritism to his own tribe at the expense of the rest of the country. Yet, the lack of response to this pep talk suggests that none of his kinsmen felt enough obligation to the king to give information about David and his whereabouts. Saul. 1 Samuel 11 verse 4. 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 121/150. Seems to have managed to alienate his own people as well as the rest of the nation. Another strange feature in Saul's presentation of the facts is that he did learn about the role Jonathan had played in David's escape, and yet he is unwilling to do something against Jonathan. Then Doeg speaks up and reports having seen David speaking with the priest Ahimelech at Nob, and he tells that the priest consulted the Lord for David and gave him Goliath's sword and the showbread. When Saul calls Ahimelech and his whole family to Gibeah, the priest comes and hears that he is accused of high treason. Ahimelech pleads innocence to the charges of helping a conspirator and thus becoming a co-conspirator against the king. He knew nothing of the friction between David and Saul and had accepted David's lie about being on a secret mission as truth. The pulpit commentary observes about this court hearing. Ahimelech's answers are those of an innocent man who had supposed that what he did was a matter of course. But his enumeration of David's privileges of rank and station probably only embittered the king. In his eyes, David was of all Saul's officers the most faithful, both trusty and trusted. 1 Samuel 2 verse 35. He was, moreover, the king's son-in-law. But the next words, he goeth at thy bidding, more probably mean, has admission to thy audience, i.e. is thy privy counselor, with the right of entering unbidden the royal presence, comp. 2 Samuel 23 verse 23, margin. 1 Chronicles 11 verse 25. Did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Though the meaning of these words is disputed, yet there seems no sufficient reason for taking them in any other than their natural sense. It was probably usual to consult God by the Urim and Thummim on all matters of importance, and David, as a high officer of Saul's court, must often have done so before starting on such expeditions as are referred to in 1 Samuel 18:13. But the Bible is singularly reticent in such matters, and it is only incidentally that we learn how fully the Mosaic law entered into the daily life of the people. But for this frightful crime we should not even have known that Saul had brought the ark into his own neighborhood and restored the services of the sanctuary. But just as he took care to have Ahiah in attendance upon him in war, so we cannot doubt but that his main object in placing the priests at Nob was to have the benefit of the divine counsel in his wars. It would be quite unreasonable to suppose that such consultations required the king's personal attendance. Thy servant knew nothing of all this, less or more. Whatever Ahimelech had done had been in perfect good faith, and though David's conduct must have seemed to him suspicious, yet there was nothing that would have justified him in acting differently. Nevertheless, in spite of his transparent innocence, Saul orders the slaughter not only of God's high priest, but of the whole body of the priesthood whom he had placed at Nob, and now had summoned for this ferocious purpose into his presence. Saul could have had no reason to believe that the whole country knew about his feud with David, and he ought to reasonably have accepted Ahimelech's defense as proof of the priest's innocence. But the king's state of mind did not allow him to think other than in terms of conspiracy. He therefore pronounces the death sentence not only upon Ahimelech, but upon the whole priestly family. When Saul gives the order to execute the whole priestly clan to the guards who surround him, none of them dares to obey such a sacrilegious order. The Hebrew word used for guards is ratziim, runner, a noun derived from the verb ratz, to run. They may have been the men who ran before Saul's chariot when he traveled. The Matthew Henry's commentary probably gives the best comment on Saul's criminal order to exterminate the whole priestly order. We read, "Never was the command of a prince more barbarously given. Turn and slay the priests of the Lord." This is spoken with such an air of impiety as can scarcely be paralleled. Had he seemed to forget their sacred office or relation to God, and taken no notice of that, he would thereby have intimated some regret that men of that character should fall under his displeasure, but to call them the priests of the Lord, when he ordered his footmen to cut their throats, looked as if, upon that very account, he hated them. God having rejected him, and ordered another to be anointed in his room, he seems well pleased with this opportunity of being revenged on the priests of the Lord, since God himself was out of his reach. What wickedness will not the evil spirit hurry men to, when he gets the dominion? He alleged, in his order, that which was utterly false and unproved to him, that they knew when David fled, whereas they knew nothing of the matter. But malice and murder are commonly supported with lies. Never. 1 Samuel, John Schultz, copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 122 of 150. Was the command of a prince more honorably disobeyed? The footmen had more sense and grace than their master, though they might expect to be turned out of their places, if not punished and put to death for their refusal, yet, come on them what would, they would not offer to fall upon the priests of the Lord, such a reverence had they for their office, and such a conviction of their innocence. It is true that Saul's guards risked their lives in disobeying the king's direct order. Evidently, Saul realized that he lacked the power to have his bodyguard executed as well, so he let them go. Turning to the Edomite Doeg, who had reported the incident at Nob, Saul ordered him to carry out the execution. It seems that Doeg went well beyond the limits of the order as it was given. He exterminated, with apparent glee, the whole priestly class, including women and children with everything they owned. This earns him David's blistering condemnation, as expressed in one of his psalms. In describing Doeg, David uses the Hebrew word Gibor, mighty man. It is the word used to describe Nimrod, of whom we read, Cush was the father of Nimrod, who grew to be a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That is why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. 1. David's psalm reads, for the director of music, a maskil of David. When Doeg the Edomite had gone to Saul and told him, David has gone to the house of Ahimelech. Why do you boast of evil, you mighty man? Why do you boast all day long, you who are a disgrace in the eyes of God? Your tongue plots destruction. It is like a sharpened razor, you who practice deceit. You love evil rather than good, falsehood rather than speaking the truth. 2. One of Ahimelech's sons, Abiathar, escapes the massacre. We are not told how. Abiathar was probably not with the group of priests that went to have that fateful audience with Saul, and by the time Doeg reached Nob to finish his work of extermination, he had a chance to flee. Evidently, it was from Abiathar that David heard about the killing of the priests, which makes him realize that he was responsible for their death. How this information must have affected David as he remembered his line to Ahimelech, we can only imagine. It is true that David's situation had been precarious after Saul had tried to pin him to the wall, but God could and would have delivered the man he had anointed to be king, had he put his trust in him instead of telling lies. David's confession to Abiathar, I am responsible for the death of your father's whole family, made him the priest's debtor. It may also have been the reason Abiathar sided with the wrong. Pretender to the crown at the end of David's life. Joyce G. Baldwin, in 1 and 2 Samuel comments on this. In the providence of God, Abiathar, one of the sons of Ahimelech, escaped the massacre, rescued the ephod, 1 Samuel 23 verse 6, and fled to join David, who thus had access to the priestly oracle, while Saul deprived himself of all such help. The only surviving priest and the king designate are together driven into hiding, each a support for the other, and their friendship continued right through David's reign. But cf 1 KGS 2:26-27, David became the protector of the priesthood. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia has this to say about Abiathar. Abiathar seems to have been at once recognized as David's priest, the medium of consultation with Jehovah through the ephod. 1 Sam 22:20-23, 23:6, 9, 30:7-8. He was at the head of the priesthood, along with Zadok, 1 Chron 15:11, when David, after his conquests, 1 Chron 13:5, compare 2 Sam 6, brought the ark to Jerusalem. The two men are mentioned together as high priests 8 times in the narrative of the rebellion of Absalom, 2 Sam 15:24 FF, and are so mentioned in the last list of David's heads of departments, 2 Sam 20:25. Abiathar joined with Adonijah in his attempt to seize the throne, 1 Kings 1 verses 7-42, and was for this deposed from the priesthood, though he was treated with consideration on account of his early comradeship with David. 1 Kings 2-26-27. Possibly he remained high priest emeritus, as Zadok and Abiathar still appear as priests in the lists of the heads of departments for Solomon's reign, 1 Kings 4 verse 4. Particularly apt is the passage in PS 55:12-14, if one regards it as referring to the relations of David and Abiathar in the time of Adonijah. There. 1. Genesis 10 verses 8 and 9-2. Psalms 52 verses 1-3. 1 Samuel. John Schultz copyright. Bible-commentaries.com. 123/150. Are 2 additional facts which, in view of the close relations between David and Abiathar, must be regarded as significant. One is that Zadok, Abiathar's Jr. is uniformly mentioned first in all the many passages in which the two are mentioned together, and is treated as the one who is especially responsible. Turn to the narrative and see how marked this is. The other similarly significant fact is that in certain especially responsible matters, 1 Chron 24, 18:16, 2 Sam 8:17, the interests of the line of Ithamar are represented, not by Abiathar, but by his son Ahimelech. There must have been something in the character of Abiathar to account for these facts, as well as for his deserting David for Adonijah. To sketch his character might be a work for the imagination rather than for critical inference, but it seems clear that though he was a man worthy of the friendship of David, he had had weaknesses or misfortunes that partially incapacitated him. 7. Saul hunts David 23:1-29. When David was told, "Look, the Philistines are fighting against Keilah and are looting the threshing floors," he inquired of the Lord, saying, "Shall I go and attack these Philistines?" The Lord answered him, "Go, attack the Philistines and save Keilah." 3. But David's men said to him, "Here in Judah we are afraid. How much more, then, if we go to Keilah against the Philistine forces?" For once again David inquired of the Lord, and the Lord answered him, "Go down to Keilah, for I am going to give the Philistines into your hand." 5. So David and his men went to Keilah, fought the Philistines, and carried off their livestock. He inflicted heavy losses on the Philistines and saved the people of Keilah. 6. Now Abiathar son of Ahimelech had brought the ephod down with him when he fled to David at Keilah. 7. Saul was told that David had gone to Keilah, and he said, "God has handed him over to me, for David has imprisoned himself by entering a town with gates and bars." 8. And Saul called up all his forces for battle to go down to Keilah to besiege David and his men. 9. When David learned that Saul was plotting against him, he said to Abiathar the priest, "Bring the ephod." 10. David said, "O Lord, God of Israel, your servant has heard definitely that Saul plans to come to Keilah and destroy the town on account of me. 11. Will the citizens of Keilah surrender me to him? Will Saul come down, as your servant has heard? O Lord, God of Israel, tell your servant." And the Lord said, "He will." 12. Again David asked, "Will the citizens of Keilah surrender me and my men to Saul?" And the Lord said, "They will." 13. So David and his men, about 600 in number, left Keilah and kept moving from place to place. When Saul was told that David had escaped from Keilah, he did not go there. 14. David stayed in the desert strongholds and in the hills of the desert of Ziph. Day after day Saul searched for him, but God did not give David into his hands. 15. While David was at Horish in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come out to take his life. 16. And Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horish and helped him find strength in God. 17. Don't be afraid, he said. My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you. Even my father Saul knows this. 18. The two of them made a covenant before the Lord. Then Jonathan went home, but David remained at Horish. 19. The Ziphites went up to Saul at Gibeah and said, "Is not David hiding among us in the strongholds at Horish, on the hill of Hakilah, south of Jeshimon? 20. Now, O king, come down whenever it pleases you to do so, and we will be responsible for handing him over to the king." 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com, 124/150. 21. Saul replied, "The Lord bless you for your concern for me." 22. Go and make further preparation. Find out where David usually goes and who has seen him there. They tell me he is very crafty. 23. Find out about all the hiding places he uses and come back to me with definite information. Then I will go with you. If he is in the area, I will track him down among all the clans of Judah. 24. So they set out and went to Ziph ahead of Saul. Now David and his men were in the desert of Maon, in the Arabah south of Jeshimon. 25. Saul and his men began the search, and when David was told about it, he went down to the rock and stayed in the desert of Maon. When Saul heard this, he went into the desert of Maon in pursuit of David. 26. Saul was going along one side of the mountain, and David and his men were on the other side, hurrying to get away from Saul. As Saul and his forces were closing in on David and his men to capture them, 27 a messenger came to Saul, saying, "Come quickly. The Philistines are raiding the land." 28 Then Saul broke off his pursuit of David and went to meet the Philistines. That is why they call this place Selah Hameleketh. 29 And David went up from there and lived in the strongholds of En-Gedi. At this point David was in the forest of Hereth, one which was probably where the cave of Adullam was located. As Saul seems to have spent most of his time and energy to hunt down David instead of protecting his country, the Philistines took advantage of the situation and raided the city of Keilah, stealing the grain as it had been threshed. The pulpit commentary describes the process of threshing, as no rain falls in Palestine in the harvest season. 1 Samuel 12 verse 17, the corn is threshed out in the open air by a heavy wooden sledge made of 2 boards and curved up in front, with pieces of basalt inserted for teeth, drawn over it by horses, or it is trampled out by cattle. One Bible scholar describes the threshing floor as a broad, flat space on open ground, generally high. Sometimes the floor is on a flat, rocky hilltop, and occasionally it is in an open valley, down which there is a current of air, but it is always situated where most wind can be found, because at the threshing season high winds never occur, and the grain is safely stored before the autumn storms commence. As the grain after winnowing is made into heaps until it can be carried home, there is always a period when the threshing floors have to be watched to guard them from depredation, and this was the time chosen by the Philistines for a foray in force. This chapter is full of exciting features, showing the adventurous spirit of David, the reluctance of the men accompanying him, and the extraordinary way in which God led. It also shows the lack of gratitude the human heart reveals when help is given. David's life, as well as the lives of the men with him, was in danger because of Saul's effort to capture and kill. The attitude of the men who wanted to play it safe seems to be the most reasonable and desirable. Safety is of the utmost importance when life is in danger. Somehow, the fact that the Philistines were able to take advantage of the tension between Saul and David irked David. So, instead of first thinking of himself and his own safety, David asked the Lord to guide him. This consultation was done by the priest Abiathar by means of the ephod v.6, probably by using the Urim and Thummim. Amazingly, against all human logic, God answers, "Go ahead. Attack the Philistines." David's men object, reasoning that they had enough to do keeping themselves out of Saul's reach. So David consults the Lord for the second time and receives the clear answer that God would deliver the Philistines into David's hands. Evidently, the Philistines had done more than merely stolen the grain off the threshing floor from the people of Keilah. They had raided the city and taken off with the people's livestock. We get the impression that the Philistines had actually occupied the city, for we read that David and his men took residence inside the town. 1 Samuel 22 verse 5. 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 125/150. When word reaches Saul, he turns pious, praising the Lord for handing David over to him, since he had taken residence in Keilah. Saul, evidently, planned to sneak up on David, surround Keilah, and besiege it so that David could not escape, and the people of Keilah would turn him over to Saul or to starve in a prolonged siege. But Saul's plan did not remain secret. There must have been people in Saul's court who were on David's side and who leaked the information to David. It may have been Jonathan, but this we are not told. So David consults God again and learns that Saul would come and that the people of Keilah would rather hand him over to Saul than be subjected to a siege. The Hebrew word for citizen, used in the phrase, "Will the citizens of Keilah surrender me and my men to Saul?" is Baal, for master. The Fawcett's Bible Dictionary states here, all the inhabitants of Keilah probably did not join in the treachery against David, only the Baalites, Hebrew, Bali for men of Keilah, verses 11, 12, i.e. the Canaanite portion, votaries of Baal, to whom David's devotion to Jehovah and the presence of the sacred ephod with the priest Abiathar were an offense. PS 31:6, 8, 21 alludes, with the undesignedness which characterizes genuineness, to this: I have hated them that regard lying vanities, idols as Baal, but I trust in Jehovah. Thou hast known my soul in adversities, David's phrase in the independent history, 2 Sam 4:9. Thou hast not shut me up into the hand of the enemy, thou hast set my feet in a large room. Blessed be Jehovah, for he hath shown me his marvelous kindness in a strong city, the very description of Keilah. Whether the people of Keilah can be blamed for the lack of gratitude toward David remains an open question. We could be amazed that Saul did not come to teach these people a lesson for having given asylum to his enemy. If he had not hesitated to kill the priests and wipe the town of Nob off the map, why? Did he spare Keilah? V.14 seems to cover an extended period in which David and his men moved around between Adullam and Ziph, during which Saul pursued them without success. At one point, Jonathan came to meet with David for the last time. The Adam Clarke's commentary comments on Jonathan's visit: it is probable that there was always a secret intercourse between David and Jonathan, and that by this most trusty friend he was apprised of the various designs of Saul to take away his life. Since Jonathan well knew that God had appointed David to the kingdom, he came now to encourage him to trust in the Most High, and to assure him that the hand of Saul should not prevail against him, and at this interview they renewed their covenant of friendship. Now all this Jonathan could do, consistently with his duty to his father and his king. He knew that David had delivered the kingdom, he saw that his father was ruling unconstitutionally, and he knew that God had appointed David to succeed Saul. This he knew would come about in the order of providence, and neither he nor David took one step to hasten the time. Jonathan, by his several interferences, prevented his father from imbruing his hands in innocent blood. A more filial and a more loyal part he could not have acted, and therefore, in his attachment to David, he is wholly free of blame. When David and his men were in the desert of Ziph, some of the people of the area went to Saul to betray his presence there to Saul. Whether they did this because Saul had put a price on David's head or for another reason, we are not told. Ziph is about 3 miles southeast of Hebron, and the area is mountainous with probably a number of caves in which it was easy for David and his men to hide. Quoting some other source, the pulpit commentary calls it the dreary desert which extends between the Dead Sea and the Hebron Mountains. It is called Jeshamin, or solitude, in the Old Testament, and wilderness of Judea in the New. Matthew 3 verse 1. It is a plateau of white chalk, 2,000 feet lower than the watershed, and terminated on the east by cliffs which rise vertically from the Dead Sea shore to a height of about 2,000 feet. The scenery is barren and wild beyond all description. The chalky ridges are scored by innumerable torrents, and their narrow crests are separated by broad, flat valleys. Peaks and knolls of fantastic forms rise suddenly from the swelling downs, and magnificent precipices of ruddy limestone stand up like fortress walls above the sea. Not a tree nor a spring is visible in the waste, and only the desert partridge and the ibex are found ranging the solitude. It was in this pathless desert that David found refuge. 1 Samuel, John Schultz, copyright, Bible-commentaries.com, 126/150. From Saul's persecution, and the same has been a place of retreat from the days of Christ to the present time. We are not told who informed David about Saul's approach, but David learned in time that staying in the desert of Ziph was not advisable, so he moved farther south to the desert of Maon. There, Saul came closest to capturing David. God intervened by allowing a Philistine invasion, which forced Saul to abandon his pursuit. David so narrowly escaped from Saul that he named the place Selah Hameleketh, which, according to a footnote in the New International Version, means Rock of Parting. Some Bible scholars believe that the name indicates that Saul had divided his army into two in order to surround David. That strategy could have been successful had it not been for the fact that the Philistine invasion forced Saul to give up. From there, David and his men moved to En-Gedi at the border of the Dead Sea. The International Standard Bible Encyclopedia states about that place: the limestone borders rise so abruptly to a height of 2,000 feet immediately on the west, that the place can be approached only by a rock-cut path. Two streams, Wadi Sajair and Wadi El Araya, descend on either side through precipitous rocky gorges from the uninhabitable wilderness separating it from Bethlehem and Hebron. It was in that area where Saul almost lost his battle with David, in the amusing incident told in the next chapter. 8. David spares Saul 24:1-25:1a. 24:1 After Saul returned from pursuing the Philistines, he was told, David is in the desert of En-Gedi. So Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and set out to look for David and his men near the crags of the wild goats. 3 He came to the sheep pens along the way. A cave was there, and Saul went in to relieve himself. David and his men were far back in the cave. For the men said, This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish. Then David crept up unnoticed and cut off a corner of Saul's robe. 5 Afterward, David was conscience-stricken for having cut off a corner of his robe. 6 He said to his men, The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, or lift my hand against him, for he is the anointed of the Lord. 7 With these words David rebuked his men and did not allow them to attack Saul. And Saul left the cave and went his way. 8 Then David went out of the cave and called out to Saul, My lord the king. When Saul looked behind him, David bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. 9 He said to Saul, Why do you listen when men say, David is bent on harming you? 10 This day you have seen with your own eyes how the Lord delivered you into my hands in the cave. Some urged me to kill you, but I spared you. I said, I will not lift my hand against my master, because he is the Lord's anointed. 11 See, my father, look at this piece of your robe in my hand. I cut off the corner of your robe, but did not kill you. Now understand and recognize that I am not guilty of wrongdoing or rebellion. I have not wronged you, but you are hunting me down to take my life. May 12th the Lord judge between you and me. And may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. 13 As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds, so my hand will not touch you. 14 Against whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom are you pursuing? A dead dog? A flea? May 15th the Lord be our judge and decide between us. May he consider my cause and uphold it. May he vindicate me by delivering me from your hand. 16 When David finished saying this, Saul asked, Is that your voice, David my son? And he wept aloud. 17 You are more righteous than I, he said. You have treated me well, but I have treated you badly. 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 127/150. 18 You have just now told me of the good you did to me. The Lord delivered me into your hands, but you did not kill me. 19 When a man finds his enemy, does he let him get away unharmed? May the Lord reward you well for the way you treated me today. 20 I know that you will surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel will be established in your hands. 21 Now swear to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants or wipe out my name from my father's family. 22 So David gave his oath to Saul. Then Saul returned home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. 25:1 Now Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his home in Ramah. Joyce G. Baldwin, in 1 and 2 Samuel, introduces this chapter with, David had been well aware that he had only a temporary respite from Saul's pursuit, which began again once the Philistine threat had been dealt with. Saul with his 3 crack battalions should have been more than a match for the fugitive, and the king was closer than he realized to capturing him, but this time David had the upper hand, and the roles of the 2 men are reversed. That Saul should have chosen the very cave where David and his men had taken up occupation was a striking coincidence that had its funny side. But it was also an unexpected opportunity for David to snatch the initiative. So far as his men were concerned, this was his chance to kill the king, and David moved silently towards his victim as if to do so, but instead he cut off the skirt, canop, of Saul's robe, a very risky maneuver to accomplish without detection, and one which would take his men by surprise. David's explanation cleverly drew the sting of his men's aggression, his repentance for having taken advantage of the king's exposure made impossible any attempt on his life. The incident described here demonstrates God's sense of humor as well as the magnanimity of David's character. Saul had to go to the place where the emperor goes on foot. In God's providence, he chose the cave where David and his men were hiding. The Hebrew text uses an interesting euphemism, stating that Saul went in a cave to cover his feet. Some Bible scholars interpret the expression to mean that Saul wanted to take a nap. The Vulgate's rendering that Saul went to purge his stomach is probably the most correct one. Saul, being close to the entrance, was well visible to David and his men who were in the back of the cave where it was pitch dark and where Saul was unable to see them. David's men urge him to take advantage of the situation and kill Saul. That was obviously the intent of the words, "This is the day the Lord spoke of when he said to you, I will give your enemy into your hands for you to deal with as you wish." There is no record of that divine promise, and it is more likely that the men merely wanted to say that this was David's opportunity to do to Saul what Saul wanted to do to him. Bible scholars differ in their opinion as to what David's actual motives were as he crept towards Saul. Some believe that initially he intended to kill Saul, and that at the last moment his conscience kept him from doing so. Others believe that his intent never was to murder, but that he simply wanted to do something. That would convince the king he had no reason to hunt him down. The Hebrew word kinekari, afterward, that follows the act and introduces the statement about David's qualms, indicates that David felt that even this insult to Saul's dignity had been inappropriate. Having received the anointing himself, David had developed a clear understanding of what the unction meant in the sight of God. He believed that an insult to the person who had been anointed was an insult to God himself. A comparison between Saul's handling of God's unction and David's makes David the hero and Saul a miserable failure. The oil that had been poured on David's head made him as humble as the Holy Spirit makes humble anybody of whom he takes possession. Before being able to confront Saul, David had to deal with his men, who evidently wanted to do to Saul what David had not been willing to do. They believed David had acted out of weakness instead of in the power of the Holy Spirit. 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 128/150. David's speech to Saul outside the cave is a masterpiece of eloquence. As Saul walks away wearing his cloak, unaware of the missing scrap, David calls him with the piece of cloak in his hand, as if to say, "Your Majesty, you lost something." David prostrates himself before Saul, who could have rushed to him and kill him while David was lying on the ground. David does not say, "Why are you doing this to me?" He makes it appear as if Saul had been listening to the wrong counselors who said that David planned to kill Saul. The scrap of fabric proves that David had had a chance, but didn't take advantage. Calling Saul his master and the Lord's anointed reminded Saul painfully of his own unction and what he had done with it. The point David so powerfully makes is that Saul tried to kill David, but David did not try to kill Saul. David's humility does not prevent him from reading Saul the riot act. The accusation is clear, "I am not trying to kill you and never will, but you are trying to kill me." And David appeals to the highest court of justice. May the Lord be our judge and decide between us. The fact that David honors Saul's unction as king does not mean that he accepts uncritically whatever the king does. Regarding David's comparing himself to a dead dog or a flea, the Keel and Delit's commentary states, and even if he should wish to attack the king, he did not possess the power. This thought introduces v. 14, "After whom is the king of Israel gone out? After whom dost thou pursue? A dead dog, a single flea." By these similes, David meant to describe himself as a perfectly harmless and insignificant man, of whom Saul had no occasion to be afraid, and whom the king of Israel ought to think it beneath his dignity to pursue. A dead dog cannot bite or hurt, and is an object about which a king ought not to trouble himself. Cf 2 Sam 9:8 and 16:9, where the idea of something contemptible is included. The point of comparison with a flea is the insignificance of such an animal. Cf 1 Sam 26:20. The pulpit commentary adds, in calling himself a dead dog, he implies that he was at once despicable and powerless. Even more insignificant is a flea, Hebrew, one flea, a single flea. The point is lost by omitting the numeral. David means that it is unworthy of a king to go forth with 3,000 men to hunt a single flea. As the king's conduct is thus both unjust and foolish, David therefore appeals to Jehovah to be judge and plead his cause, i.e. be his advocate, and state the proofs of his innocence. For deliver me out of thy hand, the Hebrew is, will judge me out of thy hand, i.e. will judge me, and by doing so justly will deliver me from thy power. In a moment of lucidity, Saul realizes that he just escaped death, not by his own agility, but because of David's magnanimity. He breaks down emotionally and weeps out loud. The following confession is amazing. Saul understands that David will be the next king, according to Samuel's prophetic words, and he pleads with David to spare his family and keep the name of the house of Saul alive after his own death. Joyce G. Baldwin, in 1 and 2 Samuel, comments, the verb cut off forms something of a recurring theme, a leitmotif, in 1 Samuel 20-24. Jonathan had reiterated it when he and David exchanged oaths of loyalty, 1 Sam 20:14-17. When the Lord cuts off every one of the enemies of David, Jonathan asks not to be among their number. In the present chapter, David cuts off the corner of Saul's robe and symbolically makes a bid for his status as king, for the royal robe stood for the royal office. And already the robe tearing had been interpreted by Samuel as a symbol of the cutting off of Saul's dynasty, 1 Samuel 15 verse 28. Now David had grasped at the kingship of Israel by cutting away part of Saul's robe, and by calling the king his father, he was preparing the way for a legitimate claim to the throne after Saul's death. On the opening verse of the next chapter, Ms. Baldwin comments, there is an appropriateness about the death of Samuel just at the point when Saul had been willing to accept the implications of Samuel's judgment on him, and to let it be known publicly that David is to be his successor. For Israel, Samuel's death marked the end of an era, but his burial under the floor of his house at Ramah would discourage any tendency to venerate his tomb. It would have been nice if the incident described in this chapter had actually ended the feud between Saul and David. As it is, Saul's paranoia returned shortly after this encounter, and he kept on hunting down David till the end of his life. 9. David wins Abigail 25:1b 44. 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 129/150. 1b Then David moved down into the desert of Maon. 2 A certain man in Maon, who had property there at Carmel, was very wealthy. He had 1,000 goats and 3,000 sheep, which he was shearing in Carmel. 3 His name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. She was an intelligent and beautiful woman, but her husband, a Calebite, was surly and mean in his dealings. For while David was in the desert, he heard that Nabal was shearing sheep. 5 So he sent 10 young men, and said to them, go up to Nabal at Carmel and greet him in my name. 6 Say to him, long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. 7 Now I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were at Carmel nothing of theirs was missing. 8 Ask your own servants, and they will tell you. Therefore be favorable toward my young men, since we come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them. 9 When David's men arrived, they gave Nabal this message in David's name. Then they waited. 10 Nabal answered David's servants, who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. 11 Why should I take my bread and water, and the meat I have slaughtered for my shearers, and give it to men coming from who knows where? 12 David's men turned around and went back. When they arrived, they reported every word. 13 David said to his men, put on your swords. So they put on their swords, and David put on his. About 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the supplies. 14 One of the servants told Nabal's wife Abigail, David sent messengers from the desert to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them. 15 Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and the whole time we were out in the fields near them, nothing was missing. 16 Night and day they were a wall around us all the time we were herding our sheep near them. 17 Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. 18 Abigail lost no time. She took 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of pressed figs, and loaded them on donkeys. 19 Then she told her servants, Go on ahead, I'll follow you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. 20 As she came riding her donkey into a mountain ravine, there were David and his men descending toward her, and she met them. 21 David had just said, It's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the desert so that nothing of his was missing. He has paid me back evil for good. May 22nd God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him. 23 When Abigail saw David, she quickly got off her donkey and bowed down before David with her face to the ground. 24 She fell at his feet and said, My lord, let the blame be on me alone. Please let your servant speak to you. Hear what your servant has to say. May 25th My lord, pay no attention to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name is Fool, and folly goes with him. But as for me, your servant, I did not see the men my master sent. 26 Now since the Lord has kept you, my master, from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, may your enemies and all who intend to harm my master be like Nabal. 27 And let this gift, which your servant has brought to my master, be given to the men who follow you. 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 130/150. 28 Please forgive your servant's offense, for the Lord will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my master, because he fights the Lord's battles. Let no wrongdoing be found in you as long as you live. 29 Even though someone is pursuing you to take your life, the life of my master will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will hurl away as from the pocket of a sling. 30 When the Lord has done for my master every good thing he promised concerning him and has appointed him leader over Israel, 31 My master will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord has brought my master success, remember your servant. 32 David said to Abigail, Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. 33 May you be blessed for your good judgment and for keeping me from bloodshed this day and from avenging myself with my own hands. 34 Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak. 35 Then David accepted from her hand what she had brought him and said, Go home in peace. I have heard your words and granted your request. 36 When Abigail went to Nabal, he was in the house holding a banquet like that of a king. He was in high spirits and very drunk, so she told him nothing until daybreak. 37 Then in the morning, when Nabal was sober, his wife told him all these things, and his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. 38 About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. 39 When David heard that Nabal was dead, he said, Praise be to the Lord, who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head. Then David sent word to Abigail, asking her to become his wife. 40 His servants went to Carmel and said to Abigail, David has sent us to you to take you to become his wife. 41 She bowed down with her face to the ground and said, Here is your maidservant, ready to serve you and wash the feet of my master's servants. 42 Abigail quickly got on a donkey and, attended by her 5 maids, went with David's messengers and became his wife. 43 David had also married a Hinoam of Jezreel, and they both were his wives. 44 But Saul had given his daughter Michal, David's wife, to Paltiel son of Laish, who was from Gaalim. The area in which this scene plays out, Maon, is the same area where Saul had almost closed in on David, but had been called away because of a Philistine invasion. Point 1 Obviously, Nabal, one of the 2 main characters in this narrative, had been informed of the details of Saul's campaign, which is clear from his answer to the men David had sent to ask for a donation. David and his company were in need of supplies, and since they had been helping Nabal by protecting the large flock and herd, they reasonably expected to be rewarded for their effort. Sheep shearing was celebrated in grandiose fashion, as it meant profit from the sale of wool. And with 3,000 sheep, Nabal would end up with considerable earnings. The fact that David and his men not only had never stolen any of Nabal's animals, but protected them from other raiders, both human and animal, would be reason enough for Nabal to generously recompense them. Nabal was rich, but like Scrooge, he kept a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone. 1. C.I. Sam, 23:19, 24:25. 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 131/150. The name Nabal means foolish or wicked. It is doubtful that this is the name his parents gave him at birth. It seems rather that it is a nickname given to the man because of his reputation of being stupid and dishonest. The name of Nabal's wife Abigail, on the other hand, means father of joy or maybe father's joy. She was as intelligent and eloquent as her husband was dense and rude. The message David sent Nabal was polished and polite, wishing Nabal well and asking for a donation, which was actually a payment due. When the 10 men delivered David's message, we read, "Then they waited," which may mean that Nabal made them wait before giving an answer. Nabal's questions have nothing to do with a request for information. He knew very well who David was and which family he belonged to. He calls David Saul's runaway slave and makes it sound as if running away had become epidemic among Hebrew slaves. He speaks euphemistically about his abundant provisions as bread and water meant for his own shepherds and nobody else. David's well-organized army, he calls. Men coming from who knows where. When David receives Nabal's message, which is reported to him word for word, he becomes furious and responds in anger. In planning to kill Nabal and all his male staff, David intended to take possession of Nabal's whole herd instead of merely the token he had asked for. The Matthew Henry's commentary comments on David's reaction. Here David did not act like himself. His resolution was bloody, to cut off all the males of Nabal's house and spare none, man nor man-child. The ratification of his resolution was passionate, so, and more also due to God, he was going to say to me, but that would better become Saul's mouth, ch 1444, than David's, and therefore he decently turns it off, to the enemies of David. Is this thy voice, O David? Can the man after God's own heart speak thus unadvisedly with his lips? Has he been so long in the school of affliction where he should have learned patience, and yet so passionate? Is this he who used to be dumb and deaf when he was reproached? P.S. 38:13, who but the other day spared him who sought his life, and yet now will not spare anything that belongs to him who has only put an affront upon his messengers? He who at other times used to be calm and considerate is now put into such a heat by a few hard words that nothing will atone for them but the blood of a whole family. Lord, what is man? What are the best of men, when God leaves them to themselves, to try them, that they may know what is in their hearts? From Saul David expected injuries, and against those he was prepared and stood upon his guard, and so kept his temper. But from Nabal he expected kindness, and therefore the affront he gave him was a surprise to him, found him off his guard, and, by a sudden and unexpected attack, put him for the present into disorder. What need have we to pray, Lord? Lead us not into temptation. David obviously did not like Nabal. Few people probably did. this lack of chemistry between them. Two characters may have been what triggered David's overreaction, but what he planned was nothing short of murder, and Abigail was right in saying that such an act would stain his character for the rest of his life and rob him from intimate fellowship with God. The pulpit commentary observes, David's determination was fierce and violent. No doubt Nabal's insult irritated him, and possibly also the rude outlaws round him would have protested against any other course. But Nabal's words, rude though they were, would not justify David in the rough vengeance which he meditated. Abigail throughout her speech argues that David was taking too violent a course, and one for which he would afterwards have been sorry. Nabal's servant saves the day for David. He reports to Abigail what happened. Obviously, he understood that Nabal's attitude could have disastrous consequences for his master as well as for the servants. This could mean that David's delegation had told the servant what they thought David's reaction would be. They may actually have influenced David in the way they reported the incident. The Servants' Act also throws a light on the poor working relationship Nabal must have had with his underlings. They must have despised him. The Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary observes about Abigail's action. The prudence and address of his wife was the means of saving himself and family from utter destruction. She acknowledged the demand of her formidable neighbors, but justly considering that to atone for the 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com, 132/150. Insolence of her husband, a greater degree of liberality had become necessary. She collected a large amount of food, accompanying it with the most valued products of the country. When Abigail meets David, he is still red hot with anger, swearing that he will exterminate Nabal and all his household. Abigail prostrates herself before David, asking him to listen to her before doing anything. Since she was a beautiful woman and intelligent, she had no trouble catching David's attention. She begins by taking the blame for all that happened, which David must have understood was not true. What she meant was that if she had been informed, she could have avoided Nabal's reaction by taking charge, as she had probably done before. What Abigail is saying to David is that God has kept David from putting his plan to murder Nabal and all his men into action. The words, "May your enemies and all who intend to harm my master be like Nabal," could be interpreted to mean, Nabal is a dumb and harmless person. May all your enemies be as stupid and powerless to harm you. It is obvious that Abigail's marriage to Nabal was not a happy one. She had not married this man out of love, and the marriage had probably been prearranged against her will. Part of Nabal's prosperity, if not all of it, was probably the fruit of Abigail's labor and sharp mind. She fits well the profile of the virtuous housewife Solomon would later compose in Proverbs 31. Abigail shows a thorough knowledge of David's life story. She knew that David was the future king of Israel. She refers to David's words in his encounter with Goliath, speaking of the army of Israel as fighting the battles of the Lord. And her reference to David's slaying must not have failed to miss the mark. The Wycliffe Bible commentary comments on the phrase as follows: "The life of my master will be bound securely in the bundle of the living by the Lord your God." This saying has long been applied to life beyond the grave, and its initial Hebrew letters are today found on almost every Jewish tombstone. This beautiful metaphor is taken from the custom of binding up valuable things in a bundle to prevent their being injured. The figure is that of a precious jewel carefully tied up, Gen 42:35. The converse follows in the prayer that the lives of David's enemies might be cast away like the stones from a sling. Her warning that killing Nabal and his men would be a staggering burden of needless bloodshed on David's conscience for the rest of his life shows her deep psychological insight. Abigail's apology for Nabal's behavior is a masterpiece of eloquence. David accepts Abigail's words as proof of divine intervention, keeping him from committing a crime that would stain his character and mar his future. He accepts the gifts she brought and tells her to go home in peace. When Abigail arrives home, she finds her husband feasting and too drunk to be able to grasp the fact that he would have been dead if his wife had not stood in the breach for him earlier in the day. So Abigail had to wait until the morning of the next day to tell him. When it penetrates to Nabal, what would have been? The consequence of his rude behavior, he suffers an apparent heart attack and dies about 10 days later. Nabal's death is also ascribed to divine intervention. The pulpit commentary believes that upon hearing Abigail's report, he may have had a fit of violent indignation, flying out possibly at her as he had at David's messengers, the result of which was an attack of apoplexy. And after lying in a state of insensibility for 10 days, he died. Although this is also conjecture, it is a possible one. When David hears about Nabal's death, he sent a message to Abigail, asking her to marry him. We do not know if there was any lapse of time involved. Where in Western culture a speedy remarriage would be frowned upon, that would not necessarily be the case in other cultures. The Adam Clarke's commentary observes, by his marriage with Abigail, it is probable that he was able to take possession of all Nabal's property in Carmel and Maon. Saul had taken David's wife Michal and had given her to Paltiel, and David had remarried by taking Ahinoam of Jezreel. When Abigail receives the proposal to become David's second wife, she tells David's servants that she consents to become David's slave, ready to serve you and wash the feet of my master's servants. Joyce G. Baldwin, in 1 and 2 Samuel, makes this observation about David's proposal to Abigail, while David's wooing of Abigail is not unexpected. Surely it is going too far to suggest that David picked a quarrel with Nabal with just such a marriage in mind. His first concern had to be to feed his troops, and it. 1 Samuel, John Schultz, copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 133/150. Was in that connection that the incident occurred. Nevertheless, the chapter does provide a proleptic glimpse within David's ascent of his fall from grace. He could be very susceptible to feminine charms. His passionate nature had great potential, both for good and for evil, and this incident should have been a warning for his life as king. X. David spares Saul a second time 26:1-25. When the Ziphites went to Saul at Gibeah and said, "Is not David hiding on the hill of Hakila, which faces Jeshimon?" So Saul went down to the desert of Ziph with his 3,000 chosen men of Israel to search there for David. Saul made his camp beside the road on the hill of Hakila facing Jeshimon, but David stayed in the desert. When he saw that Saul had followed him there, for he sent out scouts and learned that Saul had definitely arrived. Then David set out and went to the place where Saul had camped. He saw where Saul and Abner son of Ner, the commander of the army, had lain down. Saul was lying inside the camp, with the army encamped around him. David then asked Ahimelech the Hittite and Abishai son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother, "Who will go down into the camp with me to Saul?" "I'll go with you," said Abishai. So David and Abishai went to the army by night, and there was Saul lying asleep inside the camp with his spear stuck in the ground near his head. Abner and the soldiers were lying around him. Abishai said to David, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hands. Now let me pin him to the ground with one thrust of my spear. I won't strike him twice." 9 But David said to Abishai, "Don't destroy him. Who can lay a hand on the Lord's anointed and be guiltless?" 10 As surely as the Lord lives, he said, the Lord himself will strike him. Either his time will come and he will die, or he will go into battle and perish. 11 But the Lord forbid that I should lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Now get the spear and water jug that are near his head, and let's go. 12 So David took the spear and water jug near Saul's head, and they left. No one saw or knew about it, nor did anyone wake up. They were all sleeping because the Lord had put them into a deep sleep. 13 Then David crossed over to the other side and stood on top of the hill some distance away. There was a wide space between them. 14 He called out to the army and to Abner son of Ner, "Aren't you going to answer me, Abner?" Abner replied, "Who are you who calls to the king?" 15 David said, "You're a man, aren't you? And who is like you in Israel? Why didn't you guard your lord the king? Someone came to destroy your lord the king." 16 What you have done is not good. As surely as the Lord lives, you and your men deserve to die, because you did not guard your master, the Lord's anointed. Look around you. Where are the king's spear and water jug that were near his head? 17 Saul recognized David's voice and said, "Is that your voice, David my son?" David replied, "Yes it is, my lord the king." 18 And he added, "Why is my lord pursuing his servant? What have I done and what wrong am I guilty of?" 19 Now let my lord the king listen to his servant's words. If the Lord has incited you against me, then may he accept an offering. If, however, men have done it, may they be cursed before the Lord. They have now driven me from my share in the Lord's inheritance and have said, 'Go, serve other gods.' 20 Now do not let my blood fall to the ground far from the presence of the Lord. The king of Israel has come out to look for a flea as one hunts a partridge in the mountains." 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 134/150. 21 Then Saul said, "I have sinned. Come back, David my son. Because you considered my life precious today, I will not try to harm you again. Surely I have acted like a fool and have erred greatly." 22 Here is the king's spear, David answered. "Let one of your young men come over and get it." 23 The Lord rewards every man for his righteousness and faithfulness. The Lord delivered you into my hands today, but I would not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. 24 As surely as I valued your life today, so may the Lord value my life and deliver me from all trouble. 25 Then Saul said to David, "May you be blessed, my son David. You will do great things and surely triumph." So David went on his way, and Saul returned home. This is the second time the Ziphites betrayed David's presence to Saul. 1 Ziph was in the same region where Nabal had resided, and it is quite possible, as Adam Clarke suggests, that David had taken up residence there after his marriage to Abigail. Some Bible scholars believe that this story is another version of the previous incident in which Saul searched for David in the same area. Apart from the fact that there are similarities, it would be difficult to believe that the same author or his subsequent editor would tell the same story twice and get so many points wrong the second time. After the previous incident, David may have believed that Saul would leave him alone as he had promised. Saul's mental instability, as well as his profound fear and hatred of David, must have tipped the king's scale, and when Saul received word from the Ziphites, he set out again to find and destroy his enemy. When David's scouts confirm Saul's arrival, David sets out at night, probably with 2 of his men, Ahimelech the Hittite and Abishai son of Zeruiah, Joab's brother. Joyce G. Baldwin, in 1 and 2 Samuel, states, Ahimelech the Hittite is not to be confused with either of the other Ahimelechs who come into David's life. 1 Samuel 21 verse 1, 2 Samuel 8 verse 17. Abishai the son of Zeruiah was a nephew of David's, 1 Chr 2:13, 16. His sister Zeruiah had 3 sons. Her husband is never named, all of them valiant in David's entourage. Abishai is positively eager to accompany David on his dangerous mission. From the top of the hill, David sees Saul's army camped for the night. Abishai volunteers to accompany David down to the camp. They find the whole army fast asleep, including the watchman. Saul lay in the middle, surrounded by his general Abner and some of his lifeguard. Abishai considered the fact that Saul was fast asleep proof of a God-given opportunity to commit regicide. The conversation between the two must have been carried on in a very low whisper in the other's ear. David refuses, arguing that the crime would amount to treason. He had committed his case to the Lord, and he believed that the Lord would make good on the unction Samuel had given him earlier. The Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown commentary comments, the ferocious vehemence of the speaker is sufficiently apparent from his language, but David's magnanimity soared far above the notions of his followers. Though Saul's cruelty and perfidy and general want of right principle had sunk him to a low pitch of degradation, yet that was no reason for David imitating him in doing wrong. Besides, he was the sovereign. David was a subject, and though God had rejected him from the kingdom, it was every way the best and most dutiful course, instead of precipitating his fall by imbruing their hands in his blood, and thereby contracting the guilt of a great crime, to await the awards of that retributive providence which sooner or later would take him off by some sudden and mortal blow. He who with impetuous haste was going to exterminate Nabal meekly spared Saul, but Nabal refused to give a tribute to which justice and gratitude, no less than custom, entitled David. Saul was under the judicial infatuation of heaven. Thus David withheld the hand of Abishai, but at the same time directed him to carry off some things which would show where they had been and what they had done. Thus he obtained the best of victories over him by heaping coals of fire on his head. So the two borrow Saul's spear and water jug and climb back up the hill. The amazing fact that David could pull off this dangerous stunt is ascribed to God's intervention in putting the whole army asleep. 1. 1 Samuel 23 verse 19. 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 135/150. The following scene is filled with the thickest irony. From a safe distance, David shouts down to Abner, whose responsibility it was to defend his monarch. David calls the general to task for sleeping on his watch. In the question, "You're a man, aren't you?" the Hebrew word used is aish, man, which in this context may have the added meaning of hero. Barnes Notes observes, this incidental testimony to Abner's great eminence as a warrior is fully borne out by David's dirge at Abner's death, 2 Sam 3:31-34-38, as well as by his whole history. At the same time, David's bantering tone in regard to Abner, coupled with what he says in 1 Sam 26:19, makes it probable that David attributed Saul's persecution of him in some degree to Abner. Abner could have been killed because of his neglect. His obligation was to guard the king with his life. David's shouts wake up Saul, who tenderly addresses David as "my son." David in answer addresses Saul as "my lord the king." Again, David avoids holding Saul personally responsible for his efforts to kill him, suggesting that Saul may have been receiving the wrong kind of information from his counselors. David even allows for the possibility that Saul may be thinking he was doing the Lord's work. All this was meant to prick Saul's conscience in realizing that there had been a divine call upon his life, and that the unction he had received, although God had revoked it, was still the reason why David had not killed his nemesis. David's allusion to serving other gods sounds as if he believed God to be merely a local deity, whose dominion would be limited to the confines of the land of Canaan. Although this may not have been what David had in mind, the words make us realize how, in the Jewish mind, the worship of YHWH was linked to the place of God's revelation on earth, which was above the Ark of the Covenant. Jesus' words to the Samaritan woman, "A time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. Yet a time is coming and has now come when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. God is spirit, and his worshipers must worship in spirit and in truth." One indicates how strong that concept was still in Jesus' day. On the words, "go, serve other gods," the Kiel and Delitzsch commentary comments, the meaning is this: they have carried it so far now that I am obliged to separate from the people of God, to flee from the land of the Lord, and, because far away from his sanctuary, to serve other gods. The idea implied in the closing words was that Jehovah could only be worshipped in Canaan, at the sanctuary consecrated to him, because it was only there that he manifested himself to his people and revealed his face or gracious presence. Vid. PS 42:2-3 PS 84:11 PS 143:6 FF. We are not to understand that the enemies of David were actually accustomed to use these very words, but David was thinking of deeds rather than words, Calvin. However strange the concept may be to us, we must bear in mind that God's revelation in the Old Testament was localized. A New Testament equivalent is expressed in Jesus' words, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." 2. Although there is of course a great difference between a geographic place on earth and a person, the principle that God can only be met in one way is the same. The core dogma of Christian faith is that salvation and fellowship with God can only be found in Jesus Christ. To state that always lead to God is as contradictory to us as worshiping God outside the boundaries of the Promised Land was to David. It was not until the time of the Babylonian captivity that Daniel and Ezekiel discovered that God revealed himself abroad also. By then, the temple had been destroyed and the ark had disappeared. In his reaction to David's address, Saul makes the most complete confession we have heard him make so far. I have sinned. Surely I have acted like a fool and have erred greatly. Joyce G. Baldwin, in 1 and 2 Samuel, comments on this. Saul had learned by this time to admit to his faults. 1 Samuel 15 verses 24 to 25, 2400 hours 17. But never before had he gone so far as to say, I have played the fool and have erred exceedingly. In this contrite frame of mind, Saul wants David to return, but David ignores this request. He has given up all. 1. John 4 verses 21 to 24 2. John 14 verse 6. 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 136/150. Hope of being able to trust Saul's gestures towards reconciliation, so he submits Saul to the indignity of having to send a soldier to fetch his spear, and commits himself to the Lord, rather than to Saul, for protection and deliverance. Unlike Nabal, Saul had not collapsed on hearing that he might have lost his life at David's hand, but his is a sorry figure, nonetheless, as he pronounces his blessing on David and foresees his many successes, which presuppose Saul's death. These last words to David were worthy of Saul, and such as David could cherish in his memory of the Lord's anointed in days to come. Apart from that, nothing had changed. David continued his wanderings, and Saul went back to his court. We are not told whether he recovered his spear, the symbol of his kingship. As far as we know, this was the last time Saul tried to capture David. D. David resorts to the Philistines 27:1, 31:13. I, with Achish, king of Gath 27:1-28:2. 27:1, but David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand. So David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish son of Mauch king of Gath. 3 David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him, and David had his 2 wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. For when Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. 5 Then David said to Achish, if I have found favor in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns, that I may live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you? 6 So on that day Achish gave him Ziklag, and it has belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. 7 David lived in Philistine territory a year and 4 months. 8 Now David and his men went up and raided the Jeshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. From ancient times these peoples had lived in the land extending to Shur and Egypt. 9 Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels and clothes. Then he returned to Achish. 10 When Achish asked, where did you go raiding today? David would say, against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of Jerahmeel, or against the Negev of the Kenite. 11 He did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought they might inform on us and say, this is what David did. And such was his practice as long as he lived in Philistine territory. 12 Achish trusted David and said to himself, he has become so odious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant forever. 28:1 In those days the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. Achish said to David, you must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army. 2 David said, then you will see for yourself what your servant can do. Achish replied, very well, I will. Make you my bodyguard for life. Joyce G. Baldwin, in 1 and 2 Samuel, observes this about David's request for asylum among the Philistines. "I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul," expressed the human fear David had, living like a hunted animal. Though he knew that he had been anointed to be king and had seen the Lord's providential ordering of his life, he could not bear indefinitely the hide-and-seek existence in Judah's barren wilderness, especially now that he had his wives to provide for. The hospitality of Achish at Gath, in welcoming not only an army of 600, but also wives and children, was remarkable and demonstrates David's power to charm even an enemy king. David's ruse succeeded, and Saul sought for him no more. 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 137/150. The pulpit commentary states, "It was the second treachery of the Ziphites which made David feel that, surrounded as he was by spies, there was no safety for him but in taking that course to which, as he so sorrowfully complained to Saul, his enemies were driving him." 1 Samuel 26, verse 19. His words there show that the thought of quitting Judea was already in his mind, so that this chapter follows naturally on CH 26, and not, as some have argued, upon CH 24. It is quite understandable that David did not trust Saul and did not return to the king's court. It is also clear, as the pulpit commentary points out, that he could not trust the Ziphites, but what is objectionable is that he did not trust the Lord. It seems that in leaving the place of God's revelation, David did in fact surrender to the influence of the other gods of the Philistines, as in the first instance when he fled to Achish and escaped with his life in. Faking insanity, David this time also resorted to deception. After David escaped from Achish's court the first time, he wrote Psalm 34, ascribing his deliverance to God's intervention. We find no record of praise for the time David and his men spent in Philistine country during this period. In conferring with Achish, David and his men end up in Ziklag, which originally had been assigned to the tribe of Simeon, but had been captured by the Philistines. In Ziklag, David was out of sight of Achish, which allowed him to raid the Jeshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. Joyce G. Baldwin, in 1 and 2 Samuel, comments, David directed his attacks against the plunderers who despoiled Judean as well as Philistine towns. His policy of extermination protected him from informers who might have told Achish that David was playing a double game. David would report that he had fought against Judah or Judah's allies, the Jerahmeelites, 1 Chronicles 2 verse 9, whom David had protected together with the Kenite, 1 Samuel 30 verse 29. The latter tribe had entered the wilderness of Judah near Arad, to the east of Beersheba, and settled in that region. In fact, he fought only against their common enemies, but Achish trusted David, believing that David was alienating himself from his own people out of loyalty to the Philistines, whose vassal he appeared to be, my servant always. CFDUT 15:17. This was the situation when Achish was preparing for war to gain supremacy of Israel. David found himself in a tight corner when Achish committed his army to fighting against Saul, and David to becoming chief bodyguard to Achish. David's answer, designed to avoid a straight reply, satisfied Achish, but left David wondering how he would escape this dilemma. 2. Saul consults a medium 28:3-25. 3. Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel had mourned for him and buried him in his own town of Ramah. Saul had expelled the mediums and spiritists from the land. For the Philistines assembled and came and set up camp at Shunem, while Saul gathered all the Israelites and set up camp at Gilboa. 5. When Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. 6. He inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. 7. Saul then said to his attendants, "Find me a woman who is a medium, so I may go and inquire of her." "There is one in Endor," they said. 8. So Saul disguised himself, putting on other clothes, and at night he and 2 men went to the woman. "Consult a spirit for me," he said, "and bring up for me the one I name." 9. But the woman said to him, "Surely you know what Saul has done. He has cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death?" 10. Saul swore to her by the Lord, As surely as the Lord lives, you will not be punished for this." 11 Then the woman asked, "Whom shall I bring up for you?" "Bring up Samuel," he said. 12 When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, "Why have you deceived me? You are Saul." 13 The king said to her, "Don't be afraid. What do you see?" The woman said, "I see a spirit coming up out of the ground." 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 138/150. 14 What does he look like? He asked. "An old man wearing a robe is coming up," she said. Then Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. 15 Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" "I am in great distress," Saul said. "The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has turned away from me. He no longer answers me, either by prophets or by dreams. So I have called on you to tell me what to do." 16 Samuel said, "Why do you consult me, now that the Lord has turned away from you and become your enemy?" 17 The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David. 18 Because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites, the Lord has done this to you today. 19 The Lord will hand over both Israel and you to the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also hand over the army of Israel to the Philistines. 20 Immediately Saul fell full length on the ground, filled with fear because of Samuel's words. His strength was gone, for he had eaten nothing all that day and night. 21 When the woman came to Saul and saw that he was greatly shaken, she said, "Look, your maidservant has obeyed you. I took my life in my hands and did what you told me to do." 22 Now please listen to your servant, and let me give you some food so you may eat, and have the strength to go on your way. 23 He refused and said, "I will not eat." But his men joined the woman in urging him, and he listened to them. He got up from the ground and sat on the couch. 24 The woman had a fattened calf at the house, which she butchered at once. She took some flour, kneaded it, and baked bread without yeast. 25 Then she set it before Saul and his men, and they ate. That same night they got up and left. Both Saul and David are out of God's will at this point of their lives. God had not spoken to David because David had not asked. He did not speak to Saul because Saul had not obeyed. Both men are in a bind, not knowing what to do in connection with the upcoming Philistine attack on Israel. The pulpit commentary comments on the war that provides the background for this story. This was, as Josephus has observed, a war upon a much larger scale than any that had been carried on since the defeat of the Philistines in the Valley of Elah. For we find that the invasion was made from the north, and the decisive battle fought not in the usual field of operations, but in the territory of the tribe of Issachar, in the neighborhood of Jezreel. We are not indeed to suppose from this that the Philistines had conquered all the central districts of the land, and, driving Saul before them, at last brought him to bay and slew him in the north. For though Ishbosheth was compelled to withdraw to Mahanaim, a city on the eastern side of the Jordan, yet Abner is said to have made him king there not only over the Transjordanic tribes, but also over Jezreel and over Ephraim and over Benjamin. 2 Samuel 2 verse 9. It may be said, however, that these were but titular claims, but the Philistine conquests as described in 1 Samuel 31 verse 7, if not confined to the valley of Esdraelon as in 1 Chronicles 10 verse 7, were nevertheless all of them to the north of Mount Gilboa, thus leaving Ephraim, Benjamin, and Judah untouched. Nor do we find the Philistines encamped between David at Hebron and Ishbosheth at Mahanaim, or interfering in their contests. And it is only when David was made king over the whole of Israel that they again assembled their forces to dispute the empire with him, and twice suffered defeat. 2 Samuel 5 verses 20 and 25. More probably, therefore, they marched northward through their own territory, raising the whole of the military population as they went, and then, turning eastward, broke into the Israelite territory by the Valley of Jezreel. It was probably the rapid decline of Saul's power. which encouraged the Philistines to attempt once again to place their yoke upon the neck of Israel. And Saul, conscious that God's blessing had departed from him, in pitiable agony sought for unholy aid, but finally, with his sons, made a last brave defense, and died a soldier's death. 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 139/150. For David, the problem was that he had led Achish to believe that he had been raiding cities in Israel, which made Achish believe that David would have no qualms joining him in this campaign against Saul. When Achish informs David about his plans to use him in the upcoming battle, David answers, "Surely you shall know what your servant can do." The Wycliffe Bible Commentary comments, David's reply was ambiguous. The words, "what thy servant will," AV can, do, contained no distinct promise of faithful assistance in the war with the Israelites. The expression "thy servant" was simply the ordinary form for speaking of oneself to a superior. Achish believed this to mean that he could count on David's assistance, and David's intent was that God would give him the opportunity to turn against the Philistines and bring about victory for Israel. There may have been a spark of faith in God in David's heart when he said this. There was, however, no spark of honesty in this diplomatic answer. The problem for Saul was quite different and more desperate. Saul had cut himself off from communion with God by direct acts of disobedience. He knew that he was no longer God's representative of Israel's theocracy. God had told him that he was no longer king. He knew who the new pretender to the throne of Israel was, and he had tried to kill his nemesis several times. He also knew that David had openly joined the Philistines who were now attacking him. The solution would have been for Saul to step down and crown David as the new monarch. It would have saved his life. In his moment of despair, Saul tries to re-establish contact with God. But God remains silent. The proverb comes to mind, "Where there is no revelation, the people cast off restraint." When God's revelation of himself means life for man, when God knows. Longer speaks, man dies. None of the ways in which God had revealed himself in the past appeared to be open. No supernatural dream, no prophetic word, and no knowledge of priests by means of Urim or Thummim, which, incidentally, were in David's camp. Saul panicked when he saw the Philistine army line up. In the language of Charles Dickens, we could say, Samuel was dead. There was not doubt whatever about it. He was as dead as a doornail. That statement provides the decor for the events of this chapter. Not only was Samuel dead, but all clairvoyants were supposed to be dead also. Saul had outlawed all spiritualism from the country in accordance with Moses' instructions. Point 2, as Saul suspected, his executive. Order had not been carried out to the letter, and spiritualism was still being practiced. Having heard that there's a practicing medium in Endor, Saul proceeds to go there and consult her. The pulpit commentary, quoting an outside source, states, "The adventurous character of Saul's night journey is very striking when we consider that the Philistines pitched in Shunem on the southern slopes of the mountain, and that Saul's army was at Jezreel. Thus, to arrive at Endor, he had to pass the hostile camp, and would probably creep round the eastern shoulder of the hill, hidden by the undulations of the plain, as an Arab will often now advance unseen close by you in a fold of the ground." Before entering into any discussion about the following events, we conclude that Saul's fear, which turned into terror, was probably caused by the demonic spirit that had plagued him in the last several years. There is, therefore, no reason to believe that Samuel's apparent appearance was anything more than a demonic manifestation. Joyce G. Baldwin, in 1 and 2 Samuel, comments here, despite the finality of Saul's last confrontation with Samuel, 1 Samuel 15 verses 10 to 35. Saul still longed for the word of the Lord, which he had received through the prophet who first anointed him and proclaimed him king. He must have hoped that Samuel would somehow reverse the judgment which he had pronounced, in much the same way as some of our contemporaries refuse to take seriously the dark side of the Word of God. Bible scholars disagree about the meaning of the incident described in these verses. The problem is the statement, "When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, 'Why have you deceived me? You are Saul.'" The Wycliffe Bible Commentary states, The question whether the 1. Proverbs 29 verse 18-2. See Deuteronomy 18 verses 10 and 11. 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 140/150. Woman really possessed the power of communion with the spirits of the dead, or had deluded herself into believing that she had such power, or was simply a deliberate impostor, is answered differently by different writers. That the spirit of Samuel actually appeared was the view of the ancient rabbis. This is attested in the LXX translation of 1 Chron 10:13b, and Samuel the prophet made answer to him, and by Eclis 46:20. The same view was held by Justin Martyr, Origen, and Augustine. Tertullian and Jerome maintained that the appearance of Samuel was a diabolical delusion. The Kiel and Delitzsch commentary comments, these words imply most unquestionably that the woman saw an apparition which she did not anticipate, and therefore that she was not really able to conjure up departed spirits or persons who had died, but that she either merely pretended to do so, or, if her witchcraft was not mere trickery and delusion, but had a certain demoniacal background, that the appearance of Samuel differed essentially from everything she had experienced and affected before, and therefore filled her with alarm and horror. The very fact, however, that she recognized Saul as soon as Samuel appeared precludes us from declaring her art to have been nothing more than jugglery and deception, for she said to him, "Why hast thou cheated me, as thou art certainly Saul?" i.e., why hast thou deceived me as to thy person? Why didst thou not tell me that thou wast King Saul? Her recognition of Saul when Samuel appeared may be easily explained if we assume that the woman had fallen into a state of clairvoyance in which she recognized persons who, like Saul in his disguise, were unknown to her by face. The pulpit commentary, however, believing that all necromancy is faked, states, evidently the last thing that she had expected was that anything else should happen than the usual illusion by which she imposed upon her victims, nor is it certain that anything else did happen. Her assertion that she saw Samuel was probably false, and it was in feigned excitement that she cried out, "Why hast thou deceived me? For thou art Saul." She could not but have noticed the tall stature, the dignified manner, and also the intense excitement of her strange visitor, and when he bade her call up the spirit of Samuel, she must have been dull indeed not to know who the stranger was. The story actually does not give us any indication about the reality or unreality of necromancy. The text states clearly that the woman recognized Saul when she saw Samuel. None of this makes sense unless we allow for a supernatural communication given to the woman. It is my conviction that the souls of the dead cannot be called upon to communicate with the living. I believe it is possible that Satan or any demon may appear in a spiritualist seance, imitating the person called for. In practicing this kind of art, humans open themselves up for demonic influences, which is the reason why God so strongly forbids it. Although I doubt very much that it was Samuel who appeared to the woman, it is quite possible that the demon impersonating Samuel told her that her client was no one but Saul himself. The New International Version renders the woman's words as, "I see a spirit coming up out of the ground." The King James Version reads, "I saw gods ascending out of the earth." The Hebrew uses the word Elohim. Her description of Samuel as an old man wearing a robe could not be any vaguer. Joyce G. Baldwin, in 1 and 2 Samuel comments on this, the key word may be robe, the prophetic robe, the tearing of which had become the symbol of Saul's downfall as king, 1 Samuel 15 verses 27-28. The apparition sounds like a grouchy old man, whom Saul concludes to be Samuel. If this is a demon speaking, he was well informed about what had transpired between Samuel and Saul during their last meeting. No gift of prophecy is demonstrated in the words, "The Lord will hand over both Israel and you to the Philistines, and tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also hand over the army of Israel to the Philistines." The Wycliffe Bible Commentary observes, the more modern Orthodox commentators are almost unanimous in the opinion that the departed prophet did really appear and announce the coming destruction of Saul and his army. They hold, however, that Samuel was brought up not by the magical arts of the witch, but through a miracle wrought by the omnipotence of God. Earlier orthodoxy looked upon this appearance as a specter, an apparition, or delusion. 1 Samuel, John Schultz, copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 141/150. Joyce G. Baldwin, in 1 and 2 Samuel, obviously believing the real Samuel appeared to Saul, states, Saul is asking for guidance when his course of action is obvious. He has to fight the Philistines. What he really wants is reassurance that all will be well and that he will win the battle. Is this not the whole purpose of prophets and counselors, to give a reassuring message? Samuel, however, does not in any way change the message he had spoken to Saul when he lived at Ramah. He is still the prophet of the Lord, and he speaks in the name of the Lord, reiterating that name 7 times over in these 4 verses. Whereas Saul had said, God has turned away from me, Samuel uses the covenant name, the Lord has turned from you. Far from reversing that judgment, Samuel can only reinforce it, for the word he had spoken, 1 Samuel 15 verse 28, is about to be fulfilled, and the name of the neighbor who will inherit the kingdom can now be given. The message of 1 Samuel 15:18-19 has not been repealed, but is still in force to this day. The Philistines who in Saul's early days as king had defied the armies of Israel and had terrified Saul, are about to defeat Saul and his sons, who will tomorrow be with Samuel in the mysterious world beyond the grave. The Lord will give the army of Israel also into the hand of the Philistines, for the people and their army are bound up with their king. They too will suffer defeat as the result of Saul's disobedience. Commenting on the phrase, the Lord has done what he predicted through me, the pulpit commentary states, see 1 Samuel 15 verse 28. Saul's rebellion is there said in ver. 23, to be a crime as great as the witchcraft which he was at that time so zealously punishing. Here, where the sentence is being carried into execution, Saul has himself become guilty of what in his better hours he so abominated. Jehovah will also deliver Israel with thee. Rather, will deliver Israel also with thee, i.e. the nation is to share thy punishment. Tomorrow shalt thou and thy sons be with me, I shall be dead. Whence this voice came it is difficult to say. St. Augustine thought that the woman really conjured up a demon who took the form of Samuel. Maimonides treats the whole as the effect of Saul's diseased imagination, while many modern commentators regard it as a well-played piece of jugglery on the part of the woman, who recognized Saul at once on his entrance, but professed not to know him till his name was revealed to her by the pretended apparition, in whose name she reproached him for his crimes, announced to him, what now all were convinced of, that David was to be his successor, and foretold his defeat and death. In the face of such a passage as Deuteronomy 18 verses 10-12, we cannot believe that the Bible would set before us an instance of witchcraft employed with the divine sanction for holy purposes. But we can easily believe that the woman would gladly take a bitter revenge on the man who had cruelly put to death all persons reputed to have such powers as those to which she laid claim. The object of the narrative is plainly to set before us the completeness of Saul's moral downfall and debasement. Here is the man endowed with so many and so great gifts of genius, and who in so many things started so well and behaved so nobly, the victim of a despairing melancholy. His conscience is blackened with the wholesale massacre of the priesthood. His imagination is ever brooding over the sick fancy of treason plotted by his son-in-law, whom now he supposes to be in the Philistine camp. His enemies have invaded his territory in extraordinary numbers and upon new ground. To him it seems as if they have come to dethrone him and place his crown on David's head. In this dire extremity, his one wish is to pry into futurity and learn his fate. There is no submission to God, no sorrow for disobedience, no sign of even a wish for amendment. It is to unholy arts that he looks, simply that he may know what a few more hours will make known to all. Neglecting his duties as a general and king, instead of making wise preparation for the coming fight, he disguises himself, takes a dangerous and wearisome journey round the enemy's camp, arrives at his destination by night, and, exhausted with hunger and mental agitation, seeks there for the knowledge unattainable in any upright manner from a reputed witch. He has rejected God, lost all the strength and comfort of true religion, and is become the victim of abject superstition. Whether he were the victim also of the woman's arts or of his own sick fantasy is not a matter of much consequence. The interest of the narrative lies in the revelation it makes to us of Saul's mental and moral state. And scarcely is there in the whole of Scripture anything more tragic than this narrative, or any more intense picture of the depth of degradation to which a noble but perverse intellect is capable of falling. 1 Samuel, John Schultz, copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 142/150. I would still allow for a demonic part played in this whole scene. The words spoken by the apparition created an atmosphere of fear and panic that would eventually lead to Saul's suicide, which was as demonically inspired as this spiritualistic seance. The woman's concern about Saul's physical condition does not agree too well with her deceptive performance the pulpit commentary suspects of her. If she really intended to avenge herself for the king's killing of her colleagues, she would not have killed her fatted calf for him. The Kiel and Delitzsch commentary concludes its comments on this section by giving the opinion of Luther and Calvin, saying, "Thus Luther says, in his work upon the abuses of the Mass, 1522, the raising of Samuel by a soothsayer or witch, in 1 Sam 28:11-12, was certainly merely a specter of the devil, not only because the scriptures state that it was effected by a woman who was full of devils, for who could believe that the souls of believers who are in the hand of God, Eccles 3:1, and in the bosom of Abraham. Luke 16 verse 32 were under the power of the devil and of simple men, but also because it was evidently in opposition to the command of God that Saul and the woman inquired of the dead. The Holy Ghost cannot do anything against this himself, nor can he help those who act in opposition to it. Calvin also regards the apparition as only a specter, Ham. 101 Sam. It is certain, he says, that it was not really Samuel, for God would never have allowed his prophets to be subjected to such diabolical conjuring. For here is a sorceress calling up the dead from the grave. Does anyone imagine that God wished his prophet to be exposed to such ignominy, as if the devil had power over the bodies and souls of the saints which are in his keeping? The souls of the saints are said to rest and live in God, waiting for their happy resurrection. Besides, are we to believe that Samuel took his cloak with him into the grave? For all these reasons, it appears evident that the apparition was nothing more than a specter, and that the senses of the woman herself were so deceived that she thought she saw Samuel, whereas it really was not he. The earlier Orthodox theologians also disputed the reality of the appearance of the departed Samuel on just the same grounds. The chapter ends with a description of Saul's reaction to Samuel's message. He falls to the ground and swoons. The explanation given is that his fainting was caused by a combination of fear and hunger. Saul seems to have believed in the power of fasting in connection with fighting battles. The oath he made his army swear in earlier years almost cost Jonathan his life point when it took the woman and Saul's aides all their power of persuasion to make him change his mind. What follows was probably Saul's last meal in life. Like someone who is led to the gallows, he is given a meal fit for a king. The fatted calf does not perform the same function here as in Jesus' parable of the prodigal son. Saul did not return home to confess that he had sinned against heaven and mankind. 3. David's providential rejection from the Philistine army 29:1-11. When the Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek and Israel camped by the spring in Jezreel. 2. As the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were marching at the rear with Achish. 3. The commanders of the Philistines asked, "What about these Hebrews?" Achish replied, "Is this not David, who was an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He has already been with me for over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now, I have found no fault in him." But the Philistine commanders were angry with him and said, "Send the man back, that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favor than by taking the heads of our own men? 5. Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. 1. 1 Samuel 14 verses 24 to 30, 38 to 45. 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 143/150. 6. So Achish called David and said to him, "As surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased to have you serve with me in the army. From the day you came to me until now, I have found no fault in you, but the rulers don't approve of you. 7. Turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers." 8. But what have I done? Asked David. What have you found against your servant from the day I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? 9. Achish answered, I know that you have been as pleasing in my eyes as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said, he must not go up with us into battle. 10. Now get up early, along with your master's servants who have come with you, and leave in the morning as soon as it is light. 11. So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Introducing this section, Joyce G. Baldwin, in 1 and 2 Samuel, writes, in the meantime, for Saul's visit to Ender belongs a little later, though it is recorded first. David and his men had been preparing to fight their own Israelite kith and kin because there appeared to be no way of avoiding involvement with Achish in the fateful battle. Now the Philistines gathered all their forces. These words pick up the subject from 1 Samuel 28:1, where Achish was presumably in Gath. Here the Philistines are some 30 miles further north at Aphek, well on their way to the valley of Jezreel, but still about 40 miles short of Shunem. 1 Sam 28:4. At that time the Israelite forces were in Jezreel, a meeting place of roots, before being deployed on Mount Gilboa. 1 Samuel 28 verse 4, for the battle. The fountain, the source of the river Harod, at the foot of Mount Gilboa is now part of a public park. As the Philistine army sets out in a well-organized manner, the officers march up front and king. Achish forms the rear with his body, which happened to be David and his men. The Wycliffe Bible commentary clarifies as follows: the lords of the Philistines were the supreme civil authorities, but they were not army commanders. This division of civil and military authority predates the Roman system of government division of power. An argument ensues about the presence of David and his men. The Hebrew text states cryptically, what these Hebrew, which, according to the pulpit commentary, was a term of contempt among the Philistines. Achish tries to defend David, but the Philistine commanders insist that David be ordered to leave. They correctly assume that David and his men would turn against them as soon as they faced the Israelite army. It sounds as if David had been almost more popular and better known among the Philistines than among his own people. David fakes indignation at being dismissed. Joyce G. Baldwin, in 1 and 2 Samuel, comments on Achish oath and what follows, as the Lord lives, is unexpected in a Philistine oath. Can it be that Achish has committed himself to David's Lord, or is he being courteous to David in not swearing by Philistine gods? The latter is perhaps more likely. I have found nothing wrong, Hebaree, evil, in you. Already he has said to me it seems right. Hebtab, good. So the good and evil theme continues, but with a twist, for Achish fails to appreciate that David is playing a double game. It is providential for Achish as well as for David that the Philistine lords are discerning and insist that David be far removed from military operations. As Achish saw the situation, however, it was embarrassing to have to dismiss the man he had appointed as his bodyguard, and he was at pains not to offend him. Go peaceably implies that David had the right to protest against his sudden reversal, and protest he did, as though he were suffering an injustice, whereas he was inwardly relieved to be out of the battle. Or was David so double-faced that when he objected that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king, he had in mind the enemies of King Saul, and was truly reluctant to quit the march and lose a chance to be an adversary in the Philistine camp? This may well have been David's veiled meaning. He could turn any situation, however daunting, to his advantage. Neither David's turning to the Philistines for protection from Saul, nor the covert expeditions he carried out while in their country demonstrate evidence of trust in God or divine guidance in his life. 1. 1 Samuel, John Schultz copyright, Bible-commentaries.com. 144/150. Wonders if David would have had less trouble ascending the throne of all of Israel had he put his life more totally in God's hand. All we can say that Achish had been extremely naive in trusting David without any investigation into his behavior while enjoying Philistine asylum. 4. David and the Amalekites 30:1-31. When David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, too, and had taken captive the women and all who were in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but carried them off as they went on their way. 3. When David and his men came to Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and sons and daughters taken captive. For so David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. 5. David's 2 wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. 6. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in spirit because of his sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. 7. Then David said to Abiathar the priest, the son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. Abiathar brought it to him. 8. And David inquired of the Lord, shall I pursue this raiding party? Will I overtake them? Pursue them, he answered. You will certainly overtake them and succeed in the rescue. 9. David and the 600 men with him came to the Besor ravine, where some stayed behind. 10 for 200 men were too exhausted to cross the ravine. But David and 400 men continued the pursuit. 11. They found an Egyptian in a field and brought him to David. They gave him water to drink and food to eat, 12 part of a cake of pressed figs and 2 cakes of raisins. He ate and was revived, for he had not eaten any food or drunk any water for 3 days and 3 nights. 13. David asked him, to whom do you belong, and where do you come from? He said, I am an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite. My master abandoned me when I became ill 3 days ago. 14. We raided the Negev of the Kerethites and the territory belonging to Judah and the Negev of Caleb. And we burned Ziklag. 15. David asked him, can you lead me down to this raiding party? He answered, swear to me before God that you will not kill me or hand me over to my master, and I will take you down to them. 16. He led David down, and there they were, scattered over the countryside, eating,